Across Eastern Europe and Central Asia, entire cities were built using one system. From government towers to apartment blocks, schools to metro stations, Soviet architecture followed a formula: fast to build, cheap to maintain, and designed to serve the state. Over time, that practically took on its own identity: cold and repetitive, sometimes impressive, sometimes bleak, but always unmistakable. In this video, we'll look at why the Soviet Union built the way they did, what it was trying to achieve, and why so much of it is standing decades after the collapse. The Soviet Union was formed after the Russian Revolution in 1917. Before that, the Russian Empire was ruled by a monarchy, where wealth and land were concentrated in the hands of a few. Most people were poor and used to that way of life. During World War I, where collapse and famine were rampant, a group called the Bolsheviks took power in modern-day Russia and tried to build the country based on an entirely different system. This system rejected capitalism, religion, and private property, a branch of the infamous communism. In the USSR, the idea was that workers would have control over the economy and have more power, while everything would be centrally planned by the state. That is not exactly what communism is, though. It's just a system based off of it. This was a huge political shift. It changed everything: how cities were laid out, how people lived, and how buildings were designed. In their view, architecture had to reflect the new system. It needed to serve the collective, not the individual tastes or luxury. This is where the tone of the Soviet architecture begins: practical, ideological, and built to impose order upon its people. Early on, the state supported experimental architecture. In the 1920s, there was a wave of radical design, especially constructivism, which focused on utility, geometry, and materials of the industrial age, such as concrete, steel, and glass. These buildings looked different from anything Russia had seen before. They didn't imitate old churches or palaces. They were designed to suit the needs of the workers, with shared kitchens, communal spaces, and an emphasis on function over decoration. The government claimed to have pretty much eliminated homelessness, and while probably true, it fails to recognize the many housing shortages that led to cramped conditions. One example of this is the Narkovman building in Moscow. It was a kind of prototype for how the new Soviet citizen was supposed to live: less privacy, more community, and more time spent in collective life. But by the 1930s, that freedom disappeared. Under Stalin, the state demanded control over every part of life, including how buildings looked. Modernist designs were pushed aside in favor of something more traditional, but bigger and heavier. Stalin's architecture brought back elements from the past: columns, arches, and symmetry, but stripped them of warmth. These buildings were meant to show the strength of the state. A famous example of this are the Seven Sisters in Moscow, enormous skyscrapers designed to rival the skyline of New York, but they were built in a completely different spirit. They weren't about innovation or individual expression. At ground level, this is where the feeling of Soviet architecture starts to settle in. Even the buildings that aren't especially tall feel heavy. The buildings often feel disconnected from human scale. They're enormous and have no detail to hold on to, no variation or expression, just repetition. A hallway might stretch on with no change in color or texture. An entire district might look copy-pasted. And that is the same logic that planned the economy. After Stalin died in 1953, housing became the main priority. The cities were overcrowded and the Soviet population was growing very quickly. The next leader, Nikita Khrushchev, introduced a massive construction campaign focused on speed and efficiency. This led to the spread of Khrushchevkas, 5-story concrete apartment blocks built from prefabricated panels. They were cheap, standardized, and easy to build. They had poor insulation, thin walls and basic layouts, but for many families, they were the first private apartments they ever had. The result was a kind of architectural uniformity across the entire USSR. From Estonia to Tajikistan, the housing looked almost the same. That was by design. Moscow wanted control, especially under Stalin, and standardization made that possible. The materials were all the same. The layouts were the same, as well as the urban planning. It's important to understand how this fit into the larger structure of the Soviet Union. It wasn't one country, it was a union of 15 different republics, and each had a role in its overall plan. Ukraine, for example, was the agricultural base. Kazakhstan supported the space program, Uzbekistan grew cotton, and Russia led the military and heavy industry. The architecture followed those roles. Entire cities were built from scratch to support mines, power plants, or research centers. And during this time, the USSR was making serious advances. It became the first country to launch a satellite, send a person into space, and build permanent space stations. While the US eventually made it to the moon, the early space race was actually dominated by the Soviets. At the same time, major problems were spreading underneath. In the 1930s, forced collectivization led to famines that killed millions in rural areas, especially in Ukraine and Kazakhstan. Huge infrastructure projects were built using forced labor. Even later, under more stable leadership, shortages were common. People had places to live, but sometimes not enough food, medicine, or reliable heating. Reputable sources reporting these stats were scarce. The real information about daily life in the USSR has been manipulated by both sides, the West and the Soviets themselves, each with their own spin to it. When people talk about the Cold War, the moon landing usually comes up as the final word, as if that one moment ended the race, leaving the USA victorious. But it didn't, and by most other measures, the Soviets were ahead. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, a polished metal sphere about the size of a beach ball that beeped over every continent and proved the USSR could launch objects into orbit. Next came Laika, the first animal in space, then Yuri Gagarin, the first human, then Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman, then the first spacewalk, the first soft landing on the moon, the first probes to reach Venus and Mars, the first space station. As you can see, the USSR were big on the space race. For over a decade, they dominated it. The US landing on the moon in 1969 was a major victory for the USA, but it was also one of the only ones. After that, the Americans sort of stopped going, but the Soviets didn't. They kept launching, building, testing, and refining their systems. Even today, Soyuz rockets based on Soviet designs are still used to send astronauts into orbit. But the propaganda on both sides really distorted the truth. The US exaggerated its victories, and the USSR hid its failures. There were cosmonauts who died in failed launches. There were missions that never got reported. But the same was true in the West, only more polished. Both sides used space as a symbol of power, intelligence, and legitimacy. That is shown in their respective intelligence agencies, but the KGB and the CIA will be discussed in a future video. Soviet buildings from the late 1960s through the 1980s often took on strange, futuristic forms. Circular roofs, concrete wings, buildings shaped like discs, domes, or pyramids. Not decorative, but still made from the same materials, still mass-produced, but now reaching for something different. It was a way of showing that the USSR wasn't just surviving anymore, it was competing and it was advancing. This was clearest in scientific buildings, observatories, theaters, and monuments. Structures like the House of Soviets in Kaliningrad or the Ukrainian Institute of Scientific and Technological Research don't follow traditional layouts. They feel more like machines than buildings. Kind of brutal, alien modernism. The Buzlutsa monument in Bulgaria one of the most famous abandoned Soviet-era structures, was designed like a concrete UFO placed on top of a mountain. It was supposed to honor the communist movement, but now it sits empty. By the 1980s, the Soviet economy was in decline. Military spending was unsustainable, food shortages returned, and its core values had disappeared while sifting through different leaders. The same centralized system that had allowed the USSR to grow so fast was now keeping it stuck. There was no innovation, no accountability, and almost no consumer culture. People had homes, education, and basic healthcare, but not much beyond that. It did not keep up with its growth, and because of that, you can see the fatigue. Buildings became cheaper, more repetitive, and more neglected. Even the futuristic ones couldn't escape it. Paint chipped, elevators broke, concrete cracked, and there was no money. By 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved under Gorbachev. 15 new countries emerged. The state had planned every building, every street, every apartment block, and now it was gone. What's left is a strange mix of decay and survival. In Moscow, some of the Seven Sisters are still in use. One is now a luxury hotel, others are government offices. In Central Asia, Soviet buildings sit half abandoned next to glass towers. In rural Ukraine and Belarus, entire towns are frozen in place. Old factories, old housing blocks, still standing but slowly falling apart. The architecture didn't disappear. It's still there because it was built to last, not in detail, but in structure. Most of it was overbuilt, poured with enough concrete to resist time and neglect. The style was so widespread and so repetitive that you can travel thousands of kilometers and still feel like you haven't left. What makes it eerie now is that these buildings were meant to represent a future that never arrived. They were designed during a time when the system believed it would last forever. Now they sit in a different world, a world that moved on without them, and yet they still define the cities they were built for. Even after the flags changed, even after the governments fell, Soviet architecture remained, and you can't ignore it.